Welcome explorers. Today, dive into the thrilling TTP narration of Hunting with Predators by Banancake, a 25-part fan-made saga from the Nature of Predators series by Spacepaladin15 on r/HFY.
Memory transcription subject, Vickery, the honey badger. Date, standardized human time, October 31, 2136, 14 days after the Battle of Earth. I held on tight to Reese's shoulders while he plodded down the corridor, heading toward the bridge near the front of the ship. Since we'd sealed our pursuers out, the space had gone eerily quiet. The crocodile would need to work their way around the whole vessel to reach us. I hoped those were the bulk of the soldiers we'd run into up here. I took a moment to read the keycard. First officer, I exhaled. I was still panting from the previous encounter. We should be able to kill the jammers with this and call for help. Reese nodded. Yeah, but, never mind. Let's just get this done. I think we could both use a nap. I chuckled. What do you even call a nap that lasts a week? Reese snickered. A doctor would call it a coma. I just call it a good-ass nap. We arrived at the point where the hallways on both sides of the ship converged, just behind the bridge. To my surprise, the doors were closed but unlocked. Reese put his back to the wall and opened the massive steel doors. Inside, I could see rows of consoles lining a floor separated into tiers, descending to a central point in front of thick, armored windows. White light from the snow outside poured in through the glass, easily outshining the interior lights inside. Reese stopped at the door. I don't like this. Me neither. I kept a close eye on the small piece of the room that I could see. There was no movement. No sound. Yet I couldn't accept that no one was manning the bridge. Reese couldn't either. He changed to a fresh magazine and held the sidearm tight in both hands as he crept forward. Keep an eye out, he whispered. I nodded and clung tighter to his shoulders. Reese entered the room and immediately looked left, expecting to find someone hiding in the corner. I looked right. There was no one. Reese lowered the weapon slightly. Bewildered, he swiveled toward the rows of consoles, moving forward with slow, steady steps down the aisle. There were plenty of places for someone to hide, too many to cover all at once. The further we got into the bridge, the more anxious I became. Suddenly, my ears twitched. I heard something. It was brief and almost imperceptible, but it was something. I tapped Reese on the shoulder, signaling him to wait. The humans stopped and seemed to listen as well. There was nothing for a few moments, only a monotone droning coming from the ship. The sound of my heart beating in my ears was louder than anything else. Then, as if feeling the eyes on him, Reese wheeled around and aimed upward. By then, it was too late. Two crocodile had flown up to the ceiling, perched on the supports, and waited for us to walk underneath them. The prey had set up an ambush for the predator. They were unarmed, which only made their resolve seem even more absurd. They must have gotten word that we were coming from our pursuers, who were undoubtedly on their way. Controlling the bridge was crucial for them. Without the clearance to control the ship's major systems, which I was now holding in my paw, they couldn't keep us out, much less scuttle the destroyer. Reese couldn't aim upward in time. A crocodile leaped from the ceiling and collided with the human, sending us rolling on the ground. The one firearm in the room went clattering across the floor, along with the crowbar poking out of Reese's pack. I quickly stuffed the key card into my bag and hoped they didn't see it. I watched as Reese rolled onto his back and defended his face and neck with his arm. The avians sunk their talons into the human's forearm as they stood on top of him, releasing a shrill screech. Another crocodile swooped down and made a break for the gun. I clawed my way to my feet and ran as fast as possible, trying to beat the soldier there. From behind him, I dived, sliding between his legs and punting the gun away from his grasp. The crocodile grabbed me by the leg while I crawled toward the sidearm, digging their talons into my skin. I yelped before twisting around and landing a solid kick to the soldier's gut. Winded, the crocodile's grip on my leg faltered. I scrambled to my feet and dashed for the weapon a second time, but once again, the soldier caught me, sinking his talons deep into the back of my leg as I stumbled to the floor right next to the crowbar. I cried out in pain before hearing Reese across the room as he threw the avian off him. "Hang on, Vic. I'm British." I took hold of the crowbar in one paw and hurled my body around, causing the talons to tear deeper into my flesh. With a wide, wild swing, I struck the crocodile in the leg. The avian yelped as his leg buckled with a faint crack. His talons, however, still had me pinned. "Let me go." I struck him again in the same spot, and the soldier released me and drew back, standing on one leg while he let out a painful screech. Now on his feet again, Reese took his assailant by the throat. The crocodile kicked and clawed at him before the stout human rammed their head into a nearby support beam with primal ferocity. He began marching toward the remaining soldier while he drew his spear from his back. The remaining crocodile limped away in terror and reached for the gun before a spear spiraled through the air and hit him with unbelievable force. The avian gasped as the primitive weapon pierced his torso and flung him to the floor with a thud. Everything went quiet again as I looked over at Reese. He was still in a wide stance from throwing the spear, panting heavily. I sat against the wall and tried to catch my breath, clutching my chest. Reese approached and chuckled slightly between breaths. "Good shit. You're bleeding pretty good, though." I looked down to see a gash running along the back of my leg, soaking my fur in blood. I recoiled at the sight as the pain set in immediately. I whimpered slightly as I held the wound tight. I would bleed to death at this rate. Reese knelt down. "It's all right, soldier, just a scratch." He dug through his bag and retrieved a first aid kit. He put a tourniquet around the base of my leg and yanked it tight. I yelped and grimaced before he quickly wrapped it up with some fabric. Reese put an arm around me and helped me up. "You okay besides that?" I fought to control my breathing. "I think so, I don't like that feeling." I muttered. "No one does," Reese assured me. "But it's natural, Vic. No living creature just gives up and dies." "We do." Reese furrowed his brow and looked down at me. I shook my head. "Get me to that console." The human helped me over to a display and let me go as I leaned against the controls. I placed the keycard in the terminal and started booting the device. I sighed. "We're so weak. Millions of our people have been taken by the Arxer because we couldn't fight. We'd sooner trample each other than fight. If it weren't for Tenga, I'd have frozen up on that ship and burned with it. This isn't normal behavior for a Venlil at all." Reese stared down at me, his face twisted with concern and confusion. I can't go home, Reese. I can't." I slammed my paw into the panel beside the controls. "I can never go home again. They'll think I'm a freak. They'll think I'm sick." My voice trailed off. I gazed down at my reflection on the black screen in front of me. My eyes were bloodshot, my fur was matted with dirt and blood. It felt so selfish to get that off my chest in the middle of all of this when Reese may have lost everything. I turned around to see Reese pick up his pistol and crowbar from the ground. He sighed before yanking his spear out of a crocodile's corpse and putting it back on his shoulders. He approached. "I ain't gonna pretend that I know the first thing about your people or your culture." The screen came to life in front of me, loading up a navigation menu. "But if you could learn to manage your fear, then many more will follow in the course of this war. You might feel like a freak now, but the Venlil you once knew may be a whole different deal by now. You're fighting with us, after all." I took a deep breath. "We'll soon find out." I set to work taking the jammers and weapons offline. After a few seconds, I could hear voices outside. My ears swiveled back. "They're here." Reese turned to face the giant blast door. "Can you lock this door down?" "Just did." With a hiss, the heavy doors slammed closed and latched shut. Reese seemed to relax slightly. He turned to me while voices clamored outside the door. "Any way they can get in?" "Not unless they brought." My ears perked up as I heard a faint hissing behind me. I swiveled around to see sparks flying out of the crack where the two doors met. Annoyed, I turned back to the console. Heavy cutter, I mumbled. I regretted even opening my mouth. Reese seemed nervous. And, what do we do about that? I navigated the computer to the ship's security systems and pulled up the camera feed. I scrolled through them frantically. Eventually, I found what I was looking for. From an angle high on the ceiling, I could see Foster and her soldiers in a corridor. The humans were lined against the walls, covering all angles while a couple of them restrained disarmed soldiers. Judging by the handful of motionless crocodile on the floor, not all of them were so lucky. They used a key card to open a door before they methodically filed in, leaving no opportunity for anyone to sneak up on them. They must have picked it up from the captain. That would explain how they got inside and lifted the lockdown. Frantically, I scoured the console for a PA system I could use to get their attention. I'd need to only use the speakers for the section they were in. I didn't want to broadcast our location to the entire ship. I hesitated slightly as the microphone came online. "Commander? Nod if you can hear me." The soldiers looked around in bewilderment. Foster seemed to find the camera as she nodded, looking directly at me. I leaned in closer to the console. "We have control of the bridge, but we're pinned inside by the crew. They're cutting through the door as we speak." I turned around to see how much progress they had made. They had cut through the first latch at the bottom and had now moved to the middle latch. I turned around. I scanned through the cameras briefly to find the closest elevator to them. "I'm sending an elevator down. Take the next right." Foster nodded once before the group hurried down the hall toward the elevator. I turned to Reese. "They're on the way. The jammers are down, see if you can hail someone on your radio." Reese held a radio in one hand and his sidearm in the other as he leaned against the wall near the door. While he called for help, I watched as Foster and her team rounded the corner and hurried down the hall, never lowering their weapons. I sent the elevator down and watched them file inside. I looked at the doors behind me, watching sparks rain down from the top of the doors. They were on the last latch, giving us a minute or less. Foster might not get here in time. Reese was relaying information to someone over the radio before I grabbed him. "Hide." The human took cover behind the comm station while I shut the emergency shutters on the windows and cut the lights, leaving only the dim blues and greens of electronics illuminating the bridge. I hid next to Reese. For a few seconds, the hissing outside continued along with the hissing from the radio in the human's hand. Reese seemed dumbstruck. He seemed to stare at the device for a few seconds before putting it away. "What's wrong? Did you contact the UN?" I whispered. That wasn't the UN. The hissing at the door stopped abruptly. Light poured through from the hallway outside as the soldiers wedged it open. Reese got down lower and whispered in a nearly imperceptible voice. "That was the Arxer." I gawked at him as I tucked my body tighter to the back of the row of consoles. In the darkness, I could see silhouettes begin moving into the room one by one through the narrow opening between the doors. There must have been at least 10. They began to speak as they carefully moved into the room. "They're here. Be careful. Shit, they got Barim and Thela." A crocodile voice stuttered shakily. I gazed down at the floor. Hearing their names made it feel much more personal. The footsteps got closer. Reese stayed crouched on his feet with his gun in hand, ready to spring up at any moment. No projectile wounds. A predator did this with its bare hands. It snapped his damn leg in half. Stop gawking and clear the damn bridge. There are still humans on the lower levels. I heard something clatter to the floor before hearing a loud bang as the room quickly filled with white smoke. I coughed and wheezed along with Reese as gunshots rang out. Through watery eyes, I saw that most shots came from the crocodile. They swiveled around frantically as they shielded their face and eyes, shooting into the mist. One of them coughed violently as they doubled over. What is this? They're coming through there." The avian was shot before he could finish the sentence. One by one, the crocodiles started dropping. If they had a weapon, they died, simple as that. The only time I got a sense of what was happening was when muzzle flashes lit up the room, casting silhouettes of predator and prey in the smoke. There were fewer crocodile with every flash. After a few more seconds, everything went quiet. I saw nothing moving in the shadows until small lights pierced through the smoke. Foster's voice echoed through the room. "Reese! Vic! Sound off!" Reese started to stand. "We're here. Hold your fire." Reese stood up from behind the console while I peeked over the top. 2 soldiers had a crocodile pinned to the ground. The avian struggled while the 2 fought to hold her down. At first, the avian screamed for the predators to let her go, but those screams died down to sobbing as her wings were finally bound together. There was dread and anguish in her voice that made my blood run cold. In just seconds, she became the lone survivor among her comrades. I couldn't imagine being on the other side of that. I shuddered at the thought of what the Arxer might have done. At what they might still do. From the darkness, Foster appeared. She and the others seemed winded. She took a couple of breaths before speaking. "You two all right? Vic's got a pretty nasty wound on his leg, but we're good, I think." "Excellent timing, Commander." Reese chuckled, seeming slightly winded himself. I limped out into the aisle. I shut down the weapons and jammers. Reese called for help. "Did you get through to anyone?" Reese and I exchanged a glance. "The Arxer, ma'am." I stuttered. Reese chimed in. "They said they would send support. Whatever their idea of support might be." I told them we were still in the ship, but he put his hands on his hips and stared at the floor before looking back at Foster. "I don't like it. I'm not so sure we can trust them, same team or not." Foster seemed to think for a second. "Well, if they weren't on our side, they'd have finished what the Federation started by now." She looked back at her men. The crocodile was still writhing on the floor. Fortunately, she didn't seem to hear our conversation about the Arxer. But we should still be careful. Hopefully, none of them are still holding a grudge about the Gojid cradle. "You two get outside, we'll post 2 here while the rest of us finish sweeping the ship. There can't be many left now. I'd rather not leave that to the Arxer." Foster and her men escorted us back to the same hatch we'd entered through before they continued clearing the ship. When we finally went back outside into the cold morning air, we saw that a surprising number of Federation personnel had fled the ship and been captured by the soldiers outside. They were all herded together in the clearing, their appendages bound with plastic cuffs the humans had fashioned from zip ties. Flynn seemed to be trying to maintain some semblance of peace, but that didn't stop many of the prisoners from writhing against their restraints, calling out for help that wasn't coming. As I limped up the trench into the clearing, I saw Grant and another soldier huddling around Tenga at the same tree he'd collapsed against earlier. I picked up the pace toward them, wincing at every step. Reese lifted me up and carried me the rest of the way. I jumped out of his arms, plopping down in the snow behind the humans. "Tenga!" I squeezed in next to Grant. Bloody bandages were strewn about on the ground. The snow surrounding the human was dyed red. I looked at Tenga's face. He was pale. His breathing was shallow. He didn't even seem to notice me. I felt a hand grab me by the shoulder and pull me away. Grant spun me around. "Did you get it done?" I fought back tears, stammering for a moment before Reese answered for me. "The Arxer are coming to help. Or so they claim." Grant exhaled. "How long?" Reese looked at Tenga before biting his lip and shaking his head. "An hour. Maybe more." Grant hung his head. He gritted his teeth. "Damn it," he strained. I looked up at the human. "Is he?" Grant looked down at me. He shook his head. "He's a mess. The bleeding took ages to stop, and there's no telling what other internal damage he has. I doubt he'll make it another hour out here." We all stood in a circle for a few seconds, completely silent. Reese placed his hands on his hips before turning around. He took out the radio and dialed it in. He pressed a button to transmit and held the device to his mouth. He exhaled. Querek? Do you read me? Reese. The answer came immediately. I read you. You made it. Reese laughed. It's good to hear your voice, buddy. He looked back at Tenga. I know it's a lot to ask, but we need you back here. A moment of static followed. Reese, I don't think this thing will survive another trip. I pushed it pretty hard to lose those missiles. Coolant is running low. Reese and Grant held eye contact for a few seconds. Defeated, Grant shook his head. All right, disregard that. Then I reached up and swiped the radio from Reese's hand. Tenga's hit. You're his only hope. Reese had reached over to take the radio back, but it was too late. The human put his hands on his head. Damn it, Vic. You're gonna get him killed. A few seconds of silence followed before a reply came in. I'm on my way.